Good day. The last couple of hours in the war in Ukraine have been reasonably quiet. There's not been a vast deluge of information from the battlefronts as there was when the battles of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk and the areas round about were underway. Both sides are probably consolidating and regrouping, but it does seem that the Russians are getting ever closer to the town of Siversk in northern Donetsk region, which appears to be their next target, whilst their troops are strengthening their positions around Bakhmut and Slavyansk, and indeed even further south in Kramatorsk. The next stage of the battle in Donbass will probably begin in around 2 weeks or so, and we will see what happens in the meantime. However, there has been one military development which is important, though whether it's important because of the effect on the battlefields or because it's more symbolic than anything is difficult for me at least to say. And that is that the Russians now claim that they have destroyed 2 of the 4 HIMARS multiple rocket launch systems which were supplied to the Ukraine by the United States. There are 4 more of these systems coming, so there'll be 8 in total, but already 2 of them have been destroyed. I should say that Germany and Britain are also promising to supply 3 multiple launch rocket systems to Ukraine each, which would make for a total of these sort of systems supplied of 14. But as I said, it turns out that 2 of them, or at least the Russians claim that 2 of them have already been destroyed. Now, is this claim true? Of course, it's never easy to say, but generally when the Russian Ministry of Defense makes these kind of claims, and it is the Russian Ministry of Defense that is making these claims in this case, nearly always it does turn out to be true. And on this occasion, given the symbolic importance of the HIMARS systems in the war, I would have thought that the Russians would be especially careful not to make such a claim if it were not true. I would add that in the hours before the Russian Ministry of Defense announcement, there was chatter on the internet from Russian and Ukrainian bloggers and blog sites and all sorts of people of that kind, all of them talking about the fact that 2 of these systems had been destroyed, which suggests that this information was circulating from Ukrainian troops and perhaps Russian troops, and it was flying around the internet for some time before the announcement from the Russian Defense Ministry. Now, internet chatter is never to be taken terribly seriously until it is confirmed by an official source. But when an official source does say something, and when internet chatter previously has suggested that it may be true, that does, in my opinion, point to it being true. Now, how has this happened? I'm going to make a guess. I'm going to assume from this point on, by the way, that it has happened. But if it has happened, how has it happened? I'm going to make a guess. I'm not a military person, as I've said many times. I don't know much about the way counter-battery operations work, those kind of things. But it seems to me that what happened was that the Ukrainians, instead of holding the HIMARS system back in the rear and training and adapting themselves to use it, that they brought it into battle, into the Donbass battle. At least one apparently has been operating in Kharkiv region. Another one has been geolocated by Russian bloggers to Zaporozhye region after the Ukrainians were unwise enough to publish a photo of it or a film of it in operation. And of course, the Russians anyway would have been able to spot where the system was when they started seeing missiles that it was launching land on their territory, on Russian-controlled territory. And I suspect to some extent that this is exactly what the Russians do. They probably allow these systems to approach the front lines. They let the Ukrainians use them. That gives away the position of these systems. Obviously, the Ukrainians are supposed to move them, shuttle them around. I mean, they're mobile systems, but however quickly they can move, it's not easy, it seems, for them to move fast enough to escape Russian location systems. And of course, the Russians have probably got lots of drones operating in all of these areas. If they get a reasonable idea of where these HIMARS systems were at any one particular point in time, they would have a fair idea where it was, and they would keep an eye, look out for it. And sooner or later, a drone or a passing aircraft or a satellite would spot it. And once it was spotted, the information would be passed down to Russian controllers, and they would send more observation devices to track where it was. And eventually, once the HIMARS system was in a place where it could be attacked, it was attacked. And that is how I suspect the HIMARS systems were destroyed. In other words, using these systems breaks their cover. And that, it seems to me, is the game of cat and mouse that the Russians are playing with it. Now, it's important to say that this can only work up to a certain limited degree. Some HIMARS systems will no doubt be able to trundle around across this vast territory of Ukraine and escape observation. During the US-Iraq War of 1991, the US and Britain made repeated attempts to track down and destroy Iraqi Scud launcher systems. These were systems launching Soviet-era ballistic missiles towards Saudi Arabia and Israel from Iraqi territory. Anyway, the United States, with all its vast intelligence gathering apparatus, tried to track down and destroy every single one of these Scud systems, and it failed. It wasn't able to do so over the course of this war because Iraq was just too big. The range of these systems was too great. The Iraqis were able to shuttle them around the very sophisticated Iraqi road system and conceal them. And the United States and Britain were never able to fully get control over this problem. And I'm sure that to a certain extent the same will be true with HIMARS systems operating in Ukraine. However, it's important to say that the Russians do not need to destroy every single HIMARS system in Ukraine. All they need to do is to prevent enough of them being brought to Ukraine to make any sort of difference. It's questionable, in fact, whether that number of HIMARS systems, which would make a difference, could be supplied to Ukraine anyway. And Jacob Dreisen, in an earlier program, has suggested that the logistical burden of trying to keep HIMARS systems fully supplied with operating missiles would be just too great for the Ukrainian logistical system anyway. So it may be that this isn't really going to be a practical option at all. And besides, I'm somewhat skeptical about whether HIMARS is really the game-changing weapon system that some people suppose it is. But regardless of that, the point is that the Russians don't need to destroy every weapon system that Ukraine has. All they need to do is to destroy a sufficient number of them to make the Ukrainian military unable to use them effectively, or at least in any effective sort of way. And the fact that they've already, shortly after these systems were delivered, destroyed 2 suggests that they will be able to do that. Now, I will say, obviously, the Ukrainians over time, the longer they use the system, the more skilled they'll become in using it, the more skilled they'll become in concealing it. But of course, the same applies to the Russians. The Russians will be able, at the same time, to become more skilled in tracking the system, in intercepting its missiles. The Russian air defense system has not yet successfully shot down, it seems, a HIMARS missile. Almost certainly because they haven't had enough information about these HIMARS missiles to be able to work out how they work and what is the best way to intercept them. But in time, not very long time, days, weeks at most, they'll be able to do it. So the Russians will know how to shoot it down, and they'll be able, of course, to track it. And it'll be a game of cat and mouse that both sides will play with each other, but it will be enough for the Russians, with their overwhelming superiority in this battlefield, to be able to keep on top of this problem that the HIMARS may represent, and we've already seen how they are doing it. Now, I'm going to say one further last thing about the HIMARS, which is that right at the time when Ukraine first asked for these HIMARS, the United States said that it could have the HIMARS, but the United States would withhold the longest ranged rocket systems that this system can launch. And I suspect that what's now going to start to happen is that as it becomes clear how vulnerable this system is, if operated close to the front lines, the Ukrainians will come back to the Americans and they will say, look, this isn't working. It's too vulnerable. It's too close to the front lines. We need the longer range missile system. And given the pattern of escalation in this war, I suspect that just as the US has repeatedly said that it's not prepared to provide all kinds of weapon systems to Ukraine and then has come round and done so. So I suspect that sooner or later they will supply Ukraine with this longer ranged missile, which Ukraine will be able to launch from further deeper within Ukraine, further from the front lines, and use to attack Russian bases and military concentrations and that sort of thing. The problem is that the Russians, as they've repeatedly shown, have even more long-range systems than HIMARS. And of course, they also have hypersonic missile systems, which, by the way, the United States for the moment does not. The United States carried out another hypersonic missile test. It failed. This is not important. Missiles, as they're developed, often are put through tests. And often those tests are unsuccessful until the system is perfected. It's absolutely natural. No one should draw any conclusions from this. But the point is that the United States doesn't have a hypersonic missile system or a system that defends against hypersonic missiles, whilst the Russians do have long-range hypersonic missiles. And they have now started to field advanced air defense systems like the S-500 and the S-550 system, which allegedly do defend against hypersonic missiles. So the Russians are technologically in advance of the US in this area. And these hypersonic missiles, and indeed lots of other Russian missiles, as we have repeatedly seen through this war, they can attack targets everywhere in every part of Ukraine. So if the United States provides Ukraine with longer range HIMARS systems, Ukraine will be able to launch these systems at the Russians from deeper in Ukraine, further back from the front lines. But they will never at any point in time be out of range of Russian counterstrikes. And that, I think, is the key point to understand about this war. The Russians are able to strike at every single point in Ukraine. There is no part of Ukraine which with their missiles and their aircraft they cannot reach. Ukraine is not able to do the same against the Russians, either against Russian territory, that they've launched the odd missile and rocket and helicopter strike inside Russia and carried out pinprick attacks there, but they can't obviously strike at every part of Russia, the world's biggest country. And of course, their air force barely functions. To the extent that it does function, it is heavily dependent now on aircraft, which I have no doubt are being supplied to Ukraine by various East European countries. So you can withdraw the HIMARS back from the front lines. You can equip it with longer range missiles. You can't guarantee that that will change the dynamic of the battle. Obviously, the further from the front lines these systems are, the more difficult it becomes for the Russians to detect and destroy them. But the ability to do it is always there. And of course, the Russians, again, will no doubt work very hard on trying to overcome whatever problems greater distance causes for them. Of course, the other thing to say is that if Ukraine does acquire longer range missiles from the US, then the danger is that despite all the promises Ukraine has given, it will try to use these systems to attack Russian territory. And that might include Crimea. It might include objects like the Crimean Bridge, which a Ukrainian general has threatened to destroy. If that happens, of course, there will be a massive Russian response. The attacks on the command centers might indeed take place. That would be an act of greater escalation. It's something that the United States might want to consider before it accedes to any Ukrainian requests for longer range missiles. It was why the United States, after all, initially has up to now refused to provide longer range missiles. But, as I said, given the pattern of escalation, I'm pretty sure that as more of these HIMARS systems are destroyed ever closer to the front line, Ukraine will press for longer range missiles, and sooner or later the US will put aside all doubts and will provide them. So that's one thing I wanted to say about the situation with the HIMARS systems. In the meantime, there's lots going on around the world. Now, we are now, it seems to me, getting very close to the point where Prime Minister Boris Johnson loses power in London. Yesterday, two of his most important ministers, Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Britain's Finance Minister, and Sajid Javid, the minister was in charge of Britain's much-loved National Health Service. Both of them resigned from Boris Johnson's cabinet. And there have been apparently more resignations in the pipeline. And there's been a rather powerful speech by one of those two ministers who's resigned yesterday, by Sajid Javid today, saying that enough is enough where Boris Johnson is concerned. And there's been more and more talk over the next few hours that the Conservative Party might change its rules to allow another no confidence vote to be brought against Johnson. That might happen even this evening. And in my opinion, if that does happen, then it is game over. At that point, Boris Johnson, who, as I'm talking, is still trying to cling on, at that point, I think Boris Johnson will either resign or be finally forced out. Now, this political crisis in London has been brewing for a long time, and the event that has catalysed events is the latest of many scandals that have been hit Boris Johnson's administration. The scandal in question being one concerning a Conservative member of Parliament, a junior member of the government, called Christopher Pincher. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of the scandal. It's easy to find. Suffice to say that it involves sexual misconduct by Mr. Pincher towards other members of Parliament. And, well, you can read all about it. I don't like to discuss the details of those sort of things. Suffice to say that before Boris Johnson appointed him to various positions, he'd already been briefed that Mr. Pincher had shall we say, a reputation, and that he'd already been found to have engaged in misconduct. And he'd initially denied that this was the case, and then yesterday he finally admitted that it had been, and then within hours, or indeed minutes of that admission and apology, these two cabinet ministers finally resigned. So the event, the straw, if you like, that broke the camel's back is this scandal involving Mr. Christopher Pincher. All I'm going to say about this, though, is that one should not take these claims about specific individual scandals too seriously. Now, Boris Johnson's government has been beset by scandal for a very long time. There were scandals during the pandemic over the people who were supplying equipment to the National Health Service to deal with the pandemic. It was suggested that this was arranged corruptly in some way and that the government was somehow at fault for this. There was, of course, the further scandal of Boris Johnson and his officials holding parties in the garden of 10 Downing Street whilst they had imposed lockdown restrictions on everyone else. There was complaints about wallpaper and all kinds of things in Downing Street. And anyway, there's been one scandal after another. The reality is that most governments, most administrations do experience scandals. And a strong prime minister, a prime minister presiding over a strong economy and who is in command of his party, is usually able to ride them out. I'll give a very, very glaring example of this. After the British general election in 2005, it turned out that the then Prime Minister, Tony Blair, in order to raise funds for the election, had negotiated loans with certain wealthy donors for the Labour Party, and shortly after the election, several of these donors were awarded peerages. And there was a wide assumption, which, by the way, I happen to believe to be true, that Tony Blair had in effect promised peerages to these people in return for these loans. Loans which, by the way, so far as I know, the Labour Party may never have repaid, or perhaps wasn't intended at that time to repay, but I'm not going to go down and discuss that in any detail. Anyway, it is a criminal offence, as it happens, for a person, for a minister to offer honours, to provide honours in return for money, even if the money is for his political party. And Tony Blair was investigated by the police, and the police came and spoke to Blair and interviewed him in Downing Street. And this did damage Blair's reputation. But the fact was that at the time, the economy was strong, the country was at peace, Blair was still in tight control of the parliamentary Labour Party, and this only caused a dent in his reputation, though he did in fact have to resign a year later in other circumstances. So we see that prime ministers can survive scandals. In my opinion, that scandal that Blair was involved in potentially was much more serious than any of these scandals that Boris Johnson has been involved in, including, by the way, the scandal about the parties in Downing Street, in the garden in Downing Street, even though it should not be underestimated how much offence and anger that particular scandal has caused across the country amongst people who did abide by the lockdown regulations. The reason why Boris Johnson is failing, why he's about to lose power, is not ultimately, however, because of these scandals. It is because of the economic crisis in Britain. It is because people in Britain are experiencing the worst cost of living crisis since modern statistics started to be perfected in the mid-1950s. It is because Britain is now running a deficit, a current account deficit of 8% of GDP. It is because the tax revenue is not meeting budgetary needs and because inflation in Britain is high. It is because there is a wide assumption that a recession is now coming, and that because that recession is going to be extremely harsh, and it is because more and more British people are being forced to get food and help from charities, including from food banks and such things. And that has eroded the government's support, and of course, in consequence, it's also eroded Boris Johnson's support. He was already slipping in the last months of 2021, when inflation was already rising. As I've said many times, as we've discussed many times on the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I, the reason inflation took off in 2021 was because of massive overspending by the Biden administration shortly after it took office. But that was already causing inflation problems, and that was already hurting Johnson's popularity. But things have got much worse since then, and the result is that Johnson's popularity and that of his government is falling, and in Johnson's case, that means that Conservative MPs who might have shrugged their shoulders if the economy had been strong and if the government's popularity had been strong, Conservative MPs are now in a nervous and edgy mood, and they're now looking increasingly for a different leader. And the fact that Johnson has shown that he has no idea, no plan about how to deal with these problems, no apparent ability or capacity to do so, that undoubtedly has fueled these concerns. I think that Johnson also, incidentally, did himself no favours about 10 days ago, when on the eve of an important by-election, which his party lost, he chose to go to Kiev and speak to Zelensky instead of meeting with his MPs and supporters in Britain to try to organise a pushback in this by-election. And that made Conservative MPs feel that Johnson was more interested in what was happening in Ukraine. He was more focused on the needs of Ukraine than he was on the needs of Britain and on the needs of the Conservative Party. And it was interesting to see that for the first time, Johnson's support for Ukraine attracted public criticism and undermined his support. And that brings me now to the key problem, the key reason why Boris Johnson is failing. Because, of course, Boris Johnson, in the run-up to the war, was one of the most extreme hardliners. He made speeches in which he said that Russia should not only fail in Ukraine, but be seen to fail. He advocated the comprehensive disconnection of Russian banks from SWIFT. This was at a time when others, like the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, were resisting that idea. He advocated the oil import bans. He was a major proponent of oil import bans, denying oil imports from Russia. He also, of course, was a fervid supporter of arming Ukraine, as was his Foreign Secretary Liz Truss and his Defense Secretary Ben Wallace. So he was one of the most fervid hardliners with respect to Russia and Ukraine, against Russia and in support of Ukraine. And after the war began, when it looked briefly in late March, in Istanbul, that the Russians and the Ukrainians might be on the brink of starting on meaningful negotiations which might bring about peace, he talked the Ukrainians out of it. He made them more promises of more support. He was, at this point, I think, convinced, incredibly, that Ukraine was winning the war. Difficult to understand why. And apparently he promised Ukraine that Ukraine would receive more weapons if it rejected Russian proposals and withdrew its own that seemed to be moving towards peace. And Johnson not only did that, but apparently he also told the Ukrainians that if they came to agreements with the Russians which put questions about whether Donbass and Crimea were part of Ukraine, then Britain and the United States would not be willing to provide Ukraine with the security guarantees it was looking for in place of membership of NATO. So Johnson was an extreme hardliner, and it has to be said that his party, his government, the entire British political class has followed him. And it has been a disaster. It has been a massive economic disaster for Britain. Now, there's going to be lots of people who will come back and say that the inflation is not caused by the sanctions, that these attempts to restrict Russian energy exports are not the primary cause of the inflation. I'm going to say straightforwardly that this is wrong. Undoubtedly, we had a major inflation and supply chains crisis already in 2021. But Boris Johnson and the leaders of the West made it much, much worse at the start of this year when they launched this economic war against Russia. And of course, the whole economic war was predicated on the assumption that Russia and its economy were a house of cards, that if you blew hard enough, if you took big steps like sanctioning the Russian central bank, de-swifting Russia's banks, banning imports of oil and gas, that the whole Russian economy would implode and that Russia would go through a period of political turmoil, the government would fall, there would be a political crisis, and Boris Johnson would come out on top and be hailed as the Churchill of the day, as of course would all the other Western leaders in their various ways also be. So that was the assumption. And of course it's turned out disastrously. Russia has not proved to be a house of cards. On the contrary, it's proved far more resilient against sanctions than anybody in the West expected. And the illusions that Ukraine would win the war have melted away with the spring. And now that we're in early summer, I think it's looking increasingly unlikely, or at least it's accepted as being increasingly unlikely. There's been another article in the Daily Telegraph, which is the newspaper which is closest, in my opinion, in Britain to the thinking of the British government and intelligence services. And that article leads, Ukraine is running out of time. And that, I think, speaks for itself. So Boris Johnson's gamble, because that's what it was, that by taking this incredibly hardline position on Russia and on Ukraine, he would emerge as the new Churchill. It has failed calamitously. And he's now paying the political price, because with the economic situation turning disastrous, support for him in the country and in his party has been draining away. And if anybody doubts that this analysis is correct, I would suggest that they read the letter of resignation of Boris Johnson's Chancellor, his Finance Minister, Rishi Sunak. Sunak doesn't mention the Pincher scandal at all. He talks about the economic situation and says in the letter that Johnson is not being straight with the British people or telling them how bad the situation actually is, and that as the person who has had up to now overall responsibility for the economy, Sunak cannot agree to this. He can't continue to support a Prime Minister who, at a time when the economic situation is becoming disastrous, is still looking to bribe British voters with tax cuts and things of that kind. So this is why Johnson is failing. He already faced a difficult economic situation in 2021, but up to that point, despite the scandals, his support was holding up. He took this incredible, reckless gamble, along with the other Western leaders, in the autumn and winter of taking on the Russians. He thought he'd be the new Winston Churchill. He's obsessed by Churchill, by the way. He's even written a book about him. And now, of course, it's come back to destroy him. And it seems that within the next few hours, probably, or days at most, I suspect, barring a miracle or some loss of nerve on the part of Conservative MPs, he'll be gone, and Britain will be looking for a new Prime Minister who will, I predict, offer no real plans or ideas beyond those that Johnson has. But that's another story which can wait another day. And the fall of Johnson, the fall of the first of the important Western leaders who advocated this policy of confrontation with Russia, I'm pretty sure is an indicator of things to come. More of them are going to start falling over the next few weeks, months, years. Now, it has to be said that even as these events were working out in London, on the other side of the fence in Russia, they witnessed a very steep fall in the ruble. Over the course of yesterday, the ruble plunged, losing 15% of its value. It was very strange how this didn't get any mention in the Western media, though it was extensively covered in Russia itself. There's not any real mystery as to why that happened. The reason it happened was that yesterday also oil prices plunged. They fell by almost a tenth. And the reason this has happened is because we're now getting more and more signals across all Western economies that the Western economies are now sliding rapidly into recession. Now, since those dramatic moments, the ruble has of yesterday, the ruble has strengthened a bit. It's not got back. It's not regained all its losses, but it's regained some of them. It's been trading fairly stably this morning, though obviously this is a volatile situation. And I think oil is also has also stabilized to some extent. Moreover, I'm going to make a guess that though part of the reason for the oil price fall, which, as I say, dragged the ruble down with it, and by the way, other currencies too, sterling and the euro also fell yesterday. But part of that reason for the oil price crash was not just that the markets are now becoming increasingly worried about recession. I think it's also because, and I say this straightforwardly, I think somebody in Washington was trying to put some kind of downward pressure on oil prices. It can be done through various methods of financial engineering. It can work for a while until the supply chain problems start to kick in again. And at the moment, there's been no increase in supply of oil, certainly not anything like the kind of increase in supply of oil that you would need to make up the difference from the loss of Russian supply. And I have to say, I think that this fall in the oil price will be brief, barring a really heavy, a really severe recession in the West. Now, that will cause a fall in the price of the ruble, the value of the ruble. As the oil price falls, the ruble falls. I think the Russian government would not be worried about that, because provided the ruble retains its link to oil, they're not too concerned, because what that means is that Russia's exports of oil bring as much profit in rubles as they would previously, and that helps the Russian budget to stay balanced. In fact, the rise in the value of the ruble has now gone so far that Russia is getting fewer rubles for its oil, has been doing recently. And there's even been some concern that the Russian budget at the end of this year, as a result, might fall into slight deficit. I say concern, it wouldn't be a real problem. But if the ruble softens, that's unlikely to happen. And if the ruble and oil go down together, it's also less likely to happen. It may cause some problems, but not, I think, excessive ones. Anyway, there we go. So the point I'm driving at is all of these indicators are flashing. They're pointing to extreme real risks of a very, very serious recession in the West. How serious that recession is going to be, I don't know. But we're already hearing reports now of major natural gas shortages in Europe, of Germany moving towards energy rationing, and Japan apparently, after Sakhalin-2, after the Russian nationalization of Sakhalin-2, Japan is also looking to be in very severe problems from an energy point of view. I would add that if China begins to recover, well then of course things are going to become more difficult still, because Chinese demand for oil will then increase, and if China's economy grows as it puts lockdowns behind it, and even as the West falls into recession, that will put a floor under oil prices. Now, coming to China, there's been some information about China and its trading links with Russia. The first thing I would say is that from a Chinese point of view, I strongly things have been actually looking up. PMI levels have been strengthening in China over the last few quarters, or these periods, and it could be that the Chinese are going to relax their lockdown restrictions, in which case we could actually see a rebound in the Chinese economy. It's important to say that the Chinese economy today is not just an export machine. It does depend a great deal on internal consumption. But China is also going to look for export partners and trading partners, especially if the West falls into recession. And one of them is going to be Russia. Now, there's been much talk about the situation, Chinese-Russian trade. There's been much gloating comment in the West that the Chinese are not trading with Russia as they did because they're afraid of secondary sanctions. In fact, as we've discovered, they've actually been cranking up their purchases of Russian oil. And now we read this article in Global Times, the Chinese newspaper, which is to a great extent a mouthpiece of the Chinese government. And it says, Chinese brands see rapid growth in Russia with popularity on the rise long before sanctions. And then we read, many Chinese products, particularly value-added consumer products such as mobile phones, cars and printers, have seen rapid growth in the Russian market as local consumers switch to what they consider reliable and affordable products amid escalating tension between Russia and the West. And then we go on to read, Russia's top electronics retailer, MVDO Eldorado, said that the total share of Chinese brands in the Russian market in terms of smartphone sales is steadily increasing from 50% in the first quarter to 60% in April to more than 70% in June. And then we read more about how individuals, Russians, are actually preferring Chinese smartphones to American ones. Well, that's an article, after all, in a Chinese newspaper, so that shouldn't surprise us. And then they go on to say that the Chinese are now interested in the Russian car industry. Chinese car brands also witnessed a jump in popularity in Russia, with most US, European and Japanese companies announcing the suspension of Russian production or halting exports to Russia. And according to a recent survey, 46% of Russian respondents said they would buy a Chinese brand car, and 25% said they would be willing to consider a Chinese car without a European brand. And then the article goes on to say that sales of Chinese branded sedans in Russia have increased by about 30% from April to May. And the article makes an entirely valid point about the vulnerability of the Russian auto industry to sanctions. Western sanctions against Russia have exposed the shortcomings of the Russian auto supply chain. Russia only produces about 35 to 37% of its auto parts by itself, with imported auto parts making up as much as 62.5 to 65%. This is absolutely true. The Russian car industry is perhaps the industry where import penetration from the West was the highest, and where turning things round, if you're only going to use Russian products, is going to be most challenging. And then the article then goes on to say, experts said this highlights the need for a complete and reliable supply chain in which China has advantages. Chinese automobiles have performed well in the Russian market, with the popularity of Great Wall, Chery and Geely and other brands continuing. And Russian car dealers are eager to establish and expand business cooperation these days. There will be more Chinese car brands entering the Russian market to gain market share, including new energy vehicles. And we also read that a Chinese businessman, Mr. Wang Yu, who's a manager of the Russian Asian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs, has told Global Times that he has received masses of inquiries about orders and cooperation from Russian companies seeking printers whose supply has tightened due to Western sanctions on spare parts. One Russian company wants hundreds of thousands of printers all at once, and we have responded by coordinating with corresponding factories in China. So Chinese-Russian industry cooperation is intensifying. Well, what about the threat of sanctions? And Global Times says this: whilst there is a risk that of being targeted by the West, Chinese industry insiders are confident that these risks can be minimized via highly self-dependent technology and complete supply chains, advantages that plants in China possess. Unlike those Western brands, the after-sales service of Chinese brands can also be counted on. And the article then goes on to say, as the late effects of Western sanctions on Russia emerges, including on its exports of technology and products, it cannot be ruled out that with the increasing demand from Russia and more Chinese companies entering the market, the United States may further impose long-arm jurisdiction and sanctions on Chinese companies. Chinese officials have repeatedly expressed opposition to US's unilateral sanctions and stated that China will continue to normal trade and economic cooperation with China. And commenting on recent US moves to blacklist 5 Chinese companies for allegedly supporting Russia's military, Zhao Liqian, the spokesman for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, said that US moves had no basis in international law, nor is there a mandate in the UN Security Council allowing such moves. Calling the move as another example of US unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction, Zhao vowed that China will take all necessary measures to resolutely protect lawful rights and interests of Chinese companies. In other words, China, Russia are moving rapidly to integrate their industrial supply chains, despite all that you're hearing to the contrary in the Western media. The Chinese have developed self-sufficient supply chains in many industries. They're not dependent on Western technologies. That means that they can reliably supply many components to Russia without having to fear secondary sanctions. And of course, if the United States does start to impose secondary sanctions on China, China will retaliate. Now, on the last point, the Biden administration is hesitatingly looking to reduce tariffs on Chinese goods as a way of reducing inflation. Are they going to start imposing sanctions on China at a point like this, a time like this? Well, as I discussed earlier in this program, they imposed massive sanctions on Russia, disregarding the effect that would have on inflation. Perhaps they will do the same with China. But if they do, then this is my prediction. China will ride it out. It can and it will, just as Russia has done. And the people who will suffer most, the major loser, will be the West. Well, another fairly long video today. At this point, I think it's enough for me to sign off, for the day at least. There'll be more from me soon about the conflict in Ukraine and elsewhere and its global ramifications. In the meantime, I look forward to you joining me again on this channel. Remember, you can look us up on the Duran as well, myself and Alex Christoforou. Please also remember you can find us on other platforms, locals, where we publish exclusive content and where every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time I do live streams. And of course, you can find us also on Rumble, on ODYSEE, on SuperU, and on others. And you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, where you will in fact delight yourself by buying our amazing products, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, our bomber jackets, and all the rest. Thank you for joining me again today. Remember to tick the like button if you've liked this video. Please also check your subscription to this channel. More from me soon, and have a very good day.